That tract of land, in the territories of Montana and Wyoming, lying near the headwaters of the Yellowstone River, is hereby reserved and withdrawn from settlement, occupancy, or sale under the laws of the United States, and dedicated and set apart as a public park or pleasuring ground for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. These are but of the few words spoken and written in December of 1871 by Congress, later to be signed into law on March 1st of 1872 by Ulysses S. Grant. The Yellowstone National Park Act, seen by many as America's best idea, caused a ripple effect that would touch the entire world, influencing millions of people and touching hundreds of countries, and inspiring them into creating and protecting their own national parks and their own country's wonders. My name is Doane Bartlett, and welcome to History Ranger. This is the story of how Yellowstone became the world's first and best national park. Now, before some of y'all come running to the comments saying, no, Yellowstone's not the world's first national park, pause, stop. Let's talk about that, because there is some people that are concerned about that. True. There was in Mongolia about a century prior, or I should say modern day Mongolia, a century prior, a set of land and mountains and forests that were protected, but for religious and cultural practices. This was and sorry I have to read it, the Bogd-Khan-Ul Biosphere Reserve, what it's called now. A mountainous and forested area specifically set apart for religious rituals and practices. Not federally protected, and it wasn't even protected by a government that currently still exists. So although it is today a national park, it did not become so until the early 1900s. Now, yes, it did have some protection during the Qing dynasty by China in the 1700s. However, that did not continue and that did not last forever. Plus, many countries actually had very similar things going on all throughout the world and throughout all of time. Let's take Mount Fuji, for example. Since the 7th century, Mount Fuji has had either minor local protection or very minor federal protection, again, set apart specifically for religious practices. Another Japanese island called Miyajima, just south of Hiroshima, also had very similar practices set up and policies set up to prevent either deforestation, desecration of the landmarks, but it wasn't for the public pleasuring or enjoyment, but instead specifically for ritual or religious practices. So when we discuss a national park, it's important to know what we're actually talking about. Now, the idea of public parks, places where people can go to recreate, let's say, did develop somewhat in Europe. However, it was very classified. You either had to be very rich or very noble to enter, or at very certain points during festivals, the general public and peasants could enter as well. I like to go and look at the Oxford Dictionary. It gives a pretty good definition, which I will read now. A scenic or historically important area of countryside protected by the federal government for the enjoyment of the general public or preservation of wildlife. Okay, that definitely gives us a headway of what we're talking about here, as this Bogd-Khan and Mount Fuji didn't have any of those set into place specifically due to the respecting of a certain religion in protecting the location. It cannot be considered a national park, at least at that time. Now, there are national parks set up near Mount Fuji, or for example in Bogd-Khan-Ul Biosphere Reserve. They are now national parks, but not the oldest. But if you want to continue to argue that even a place that is set apart for religious practices should still be considered the longest and you could say oldest national park, you would have other concerns and issues. For example, Temple Mount in Jerusalem, surpassing Mount Fuji's protection by 1,000 plus years. And if you want to go even further back, look at Mount Olympus. These things have been protected for thousands of years. And so you would have a hard time arguing that this one in Mongolia, which wasn't even a country yet until the 1900s again, it can't be considered the oldest national park. Now, if we are going to be talking about things that happened really far in the past 1,000 plus years ago, let's go back to Yellowstone, because there's a lot we can talk about. Now, I could talk about the incredible geologic history of the greater Yellowstone area, but it's about 4 billion years long of history. And so, yeah, we don't really have the time to go into that, though I might cover that in some later videos. However, what I want to talk about is the human habitation, visitation, and you could say enjoyment of the greater Yellowstone area, specifically by those who inhabited it before the Euro Americans, that being the Native Americans. The greater Yellowstone ecosystem has been home to humans for approximately 11 to 12,000-ish years ago. However, that's just according to the current archaeological data, so likely it was even slightly before then. Many of these peoples hunted, gathered, picked berries, made clothes, even made temporary homes and sometimes permanent homes in this greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Some, but not all of the associated tribes to the national park include these: the Kiowa, the Blackfeet, the Nez Perce, the Crow, the Shoshone, the Bannock, and most famous specifically in the Yellowstone area, the Tucutuca. All of these tribes had varying different views about the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Just as every other place on the planet, people view things in different ways depending on what religion they come from, cultural background, how they were raised. It's no different than with the Native Americans. They weren't just one cohesive whole, these were individual societies, and it showed in how they viewed the park. Some people viewed this as simply a good trade route to go through during the summer months. Some viewed it as great hunting grounds. Some people worshiped the features and had great respect for them, while others feared them and believed they had bad kind of spirits about them, leaking out from the earth. Others actually believed it was the ancestral home of their, well, ancestors, that their ancestors quite literally came out of the ground here and they believed it was a sacred place that should be protected. However, there was only one group that masterfully used what they found there, and that was the Tucutuca. The Tucutuca were a breakoff of the Greater Shoshone tribe. The Shoshone tribe had a lot of smaller breakoffs, however, they all spoke the similar language. However, within the Shoshone culture, depending on what kind of resources you used, for example, animals you ate or hunted, gave you a certain kind of social class. And unfortunately for the Tucutuca, or called the sheep eaters, they were near the bottom of that social hierarchy because bighorn sheep weren't seen as the most magnificent, powerful, and great animal at the time, unlike elk or bison or bear, these very respectable animals. And so the Tucutuca weren't seen very in a, you could say, a great light. However, they made up for it in something else, and that was their craftsmanship. The Tucutuca tribe was famous all the way through the late 1800s. In fact, most of the European explorers that went and traveled through the park mentioned them, which just shows how prevalent they were in the area. But every time they mentioned them in great detail and often romanticized their experience in meeting them. Now, I mentioned that they were excellent craftsmen, and that they were. But let's talk about specifically what they were good at crafting. First was obsidian. Within Yellowstone National Park, we have an area called Obsidian Cliff. This was a mining quarry of sorts where the Tucutuca tribe and sometimes other tribes would come in, mine or quarry off the obsidian in these large cliffs, chisel them down into useful tools, sell, trade, or use them to make better items, which they did, and they did very, very well. If you don't know, obsidian is a glassy volcanic material, very, very sharp and very deadly if used, I guess, in an incorrect or correct way if that's your intent. But the Tucutuca, they said, let's actually use this for maybe something better than just killing. Let's use it to create something. Interesting, right? Well, this is what they did. The second thing they were especially known for was the thing they crafted with the obsidian. They would sharpen the obsidian, which is breaking it off, typically with the horns or antlers of animals. Sometimes bones as well worked pretty okay. They would then take that very, very sharp item and use it to cut, or you could say strip, different animal hides. Most specifically, the bighorn sheep. One traveler named Osborne Russell, who was a fur trapper in the area, was able to meet the Tucutuca tribe and traded with them. In numerous of his accounts, he repeats that the quality and expertise of their craftsmanship, their clothing, their tents, their canvases, and blankets were phenomenal. Perfect quality and long-lasting too. So much so that by one account of his, he even traded his own firearm just for a few of the blankets. Now, the Tucutuca, though, were very well known for their expertise in crafting the bighorn sheep hide, they were known for something even more impressive. and that was the horns. Now, when you think of a bighorn sheep horn such as this, these guys are not small, and their horns weigh, well, a lot. These things can withstand a semi-truck driving over them. Pretty crazy. How the heck are you going to do anything with something that strong? Okay, sure, you can hopefully break off the end of it, use it as a horn as people in the past have, but the Tucutuca, they said, we have a better idea. Using their resources to their advantage, which were geysers and hot springs living in Yellowstone, they said, what if we take these same horns, tie them to, say, the rope we have made out of the bighorn sheep hide, lower them into the geysers or into the hot springs, let them soak for a few days, take them out, we can start molding them into doing something. So just as a blacksmith would take his sword, stick it into the furnace to get it nice and hot, pound on it, mold it, sharpen it, start making this into a weapon, so did the Tucutuca with the geysers and with the bighorn sheep horn. They would repeatedly soak, take out mold, soak, take out mold, soak, take out mold, over and over and over again until they had made a bow out of bighorn sheep horn. One that was flexible enough at the ends so that they could tie then the sinews and tendons of the bighorn sheep into a string to the actual horn bow now. And not only was it going to be a powerful bow, but it was going to be a durable one they didn't have to worry about breaking. Incredible. It's honestly unsurprising, however, that when living in such a harsh environment, you will adapt. And in my opinion, it's probably one of the coolest examples of that, where people have lived in a very difficult and harsh climate, yet chosen to overcome it just by thinking, just by observing and figuring things out for themselves. A brilliant example of how scientific minds have always existed throughout all of time and eternity. Now, come the late 15 and early 1600s, something changed in the general environment of these native tribes. And that was the arrival of people that looked very different than them, acted very different than them, and spoke very different than them. And that being the European explorers. As early as the late 1600s and early 1700s, to the greater Yellowstone ecosystem came Spanish explorers and French fur trappers, and the occasional person from the burgeoning area of the British colonies. Now, these people came and they went mostly because of the great dangers that lied trespassing into the Indians' territory. But some decided to stay, learn the languages, and kind of assimilate into the people's culture. And although many of these tribes had a kind of curiosity about what these new people were bringing and what they could offer, a large majority of them had some kind of caution towards it. For good reason, and especially good reason, as would conclude later on. So much so that between the 1750s and the end of the 1800s, it was common knowledge not to go and trespass casually into Indian territory. It just wasn't safe. Nevertheless, people seeking better opportunities, possible land grabs, and money to be made, they risked that and they started coming out. However, what really started the pool of people to the west was because of this guy. Now, this guy, not the brightest mind. He was losing a war that he had started, and being in a tough situation said, well, what can I do to get some more money? Well, he decided to sell a large tract of land called the Louisiana Territory to a brand new fledgling nation on the east coast of this new continent called the United States of America. The purchase of the Louisiana Territory secured more land, supposedly, that was full of riches and resources for this new country. And of course, the head of the red, white, and blue did not spare a moment in sending people out there to investigate. So, needing somebody to find out what was out there, he called upon two men to lead a group out west to try to find a water route that connected the East Coast and the West Coast. And although they were unsuccessful in finding a route like that, the Lewis and Clark expedition was successful in reaching the West Coast. If you want a good video to watch about that, I would suggest checking out John. He runs the Western Extravaganza page, or Wild West Extravaganza page on YouTube. I have no affiliation with him, but he has some great videos, long, really in-depth. Love the content, so check that out if you want to learn more about that Lewis and Clark expedition. However, after arriving at the West Coast and starting to make their way back, one of the men on the journey John Colter, decided to break off and check out some land that he had heard rumors about. So in the winters of 1807 and early winters of 1808, John Colter trekked into what later became known, due to his stories, as Colter's Hell. This place he had described was a place full of gases escaping from the earth, bubbling pools of water that would occasionally spout it into the sky. On a more factual note, however, historians argue whether or not John Colter actually entered the park of Yellowstone, that general area. Most actually think he was just outside the boundaries, slightly to the east, still seeing the same features or claiming to have. Of course, those features do not exist here in the United States of America. Or so people thought. Either way, whether these stories were true or false, it did not really excite many people at all. But what did excite them was the news of a great amount of fur, especially bison, elk, and beaver. The Western Rocky Mountain fur trade, most prevalent between about 1810 to 1850s, brought a lot of wild frontiersmen, mountain men, and fur trappers into the Rockies. Now, these men had great success hunting deer, elk, bison, but their most focused fur was beaver, of course. However, as so many fur trappers started going out to hunt beaver, following riverways, trying to find lakes, anywhere where these beavers might be hiding, more rumors of these reverse waterfalls of boiling water and deep pools of boiling temperature as well, and these disgusting pots of mud started spreading. Now, when you have somebody like John Colter, somebody a little bit more reputable, part of a government-led expedition, okay, maybe. But when you have drunken, illiterate fur trappers telling these stories, surely they're false. They're obviously fake. Duh, right? One of the claims was that a man could take a live chicken, throw it through one of these reverse waterfalls of boiling water, and when the chicken would go through, it'd be completely defeathered and cooked by the time it landed on the ground, ready to eat. One man claimed that you could throw it through, put a plate on the other side, and it would cook it, land on the plate, and you could start eating. Obviously a fake story. Of course, the feature doesn't exist. There's no way. There's no way that could ever happen. And so nobody believed these things. However, that was until you had some more reputable sources start saying some of these same things. One of these mountain men that broke this chain of being unreliable, though still many people believed he exaggerated the things that he saw, was one character who is credited to building the West. And his name is Jim Bridger. Now, Jim Bridger is another one of those fellows I would talk about for hours. However, this is a video trying to be more focused on the establishment of Yellowstone. If you do want to really learn a lot about this character, Jim Bridger, what he has done for the Wild West, I would recommend checking out Josh with Wild West Extravaganza. Again, no association with him, don't know the guy. His videos are incredible though, so check it out. Jim Bridger, though, did enter the Greater Yellowstone area a few times, and although he was known to exaggerate his stories as much as the next mountain man, he was seen as a little bit more reliable. However, his tall tales of petrified trees and bubbling cauldrons of mud weren't taken very seriously. Though, since Bridger was a fairly reputable and well-known person, some people did believe these crazy outlandish stories. And this would become important about a decade later when he would meet one Nathaniel P. Langford, a story we will get to shortly. Following this fur trade boom, another one happened, that being the Montana Gold Rush. And as this brought more people out looking both for gold, timber, and cattle opportunities, one man by the name of David E. Folsom picked up news about these interesting stories from the headwaters of the Yellowstone River, and he itched to see it for himself. In September of 1869, David E. Folsom, a businessman, rancher, and entrepreneur in the area, as well as Charles W. Cook, a business owner and frontiersman in the area, and William Peterson, a cowhand on Folsom's ranch, in a privately funded expedition, left into the greater Yellowstone area. Leaving from Diamond City, Montana, and following the Yellowstone River, these men hoped to find the source of the Yellowstone River. The expedition, taking roughly 2 months to finish, brought the explorers into a world they could not imagine was real. Neither did they believe anybody else would if they started talking about it. Upon returning from this great expedition into the wilds of Yellowstone near the headwaters, they were very weary and worried about talking about these crazy experiences they had. Because when you are a reputable businessman and start telling the same things as the drunken illiterate fur trappers, people aren't going to take you seriously for very long. And they knew that. Nevertheless, they did, to a select few, share their notes, maps, and discoveries. And those few people they did share them with were very, very important. Folsom would go on to share his experience, journals, maps, and information with one of Cook's friends, the general surveyor of Montana Territory, named Henry D. Washburn. Washburn, who trusted Cook and Folsom's stories and accounts, was eager to start copying and writing down the maps and the stories and the directions and anything they had about their expedition. And while he was doing this, he started thinking in his mind about the likelihood of him staging his own expedition to see the area surrounding the headwaters of the Yellowstone River. As Washburn was pondering on this potential expedition, Folsom started sharing his story with a few other people he trusted a little bit more and believed wouldn't look at him like a crazy mountain man drunk. That friend of his was one Nathaniel P. Langford. Langford, a businessman entrepreneur and the occasional vigilante lawman, heard about some explorators going into the area to see what was out there. He had heard the typical stories from drunken mountain men and fur trappers talking about what they had seen, and of course he blew it away as nothing but the figments of their imagination. But when Folsom came to him, he started believing it just a little bit more. However, when Langford heard about it, his initial thoughts were, how can I make money out of this? The ideas of bringing the railroad to the greater Yellowstone ecosystem started forming in his mind, specifically around the topics of the gold, timber, and tourism to this interesting land. That being said, he still wasn't even fully convinced this was real. Folsom's stories did have a little bit more credibility to him, as Folsom was an honest man. However, Langford wanted to see it with his own eyes, to make sure these stories weren't just made up out of the wild. Recounting a meeting he had with one Jim Bridger, Nathaniel P. Langford later writes down in a journal the following. I first became acquainted with Bridger in the year 1866. He was then employed by a wagon road company of which I was president to conduct immigration from the States to Montana by way of Fort Laramie, the Bighorn River, and Immigrant Gulch. He told me in Virginia City, Montana, of the existence of hot spouting springs in the vicinity of the source of the Yellowstone and Madison rivers. He said that he had seen a column of water as large as his body spout as high as the flagpole in Virginia City, which was about 60 feet high. The more I pondered upon this statement, the more I was impressed with the probability of its truth. If he had told me of the existence of falls 1,000 feet high, I would have considered his story an exaggeration of a phenomenon he had really beheld. But I did not think his imagination was sufficiently fertile to originate the story of the existence of spouting geysers unless he had really seen one. And therefore, I was inclined to give credence to this statement and to believe that such a wonder did really exist. Later writing also about his account with David E. Folsom, Langford writes, David E. Folsom was enrolled as a member of an expedition, and when it was found that no large party could be organized, Mr. Folsom and his partner, C.W. Cook, and Mr. Peterson, a helper on Folsom's ranch, in the face of threatened dangers from Indians, visited the Grand Canyon, the falls of the Yellowstone, and Yellowstone Lake, and then turned in a northwesterly direction, emerging into the lower geyser basin, where he found a geyser in action, the water of which, says Mr. Folsom in his record of the expedition, came rushing up and shot into the air at least 80 feet, causing us to stampede for higher ground. Langford, recounting all these stories he had been told, started to believe. Langford was promptly introduced to General Washburn, and the men and some of the other men that would accompany the expedition pondered on all the riches they could earn. During this time, the idea of tourism was becoming much more prominent. And so if the Yellowstone area was really as awe-inspiring and magnificent as Folsom had described it, it could be a great boon, especially if you had ties to the railroad. Establish a direct line to the area, and then have the land privatized and your tourism industry monopolized, you were going to be set forever. And that's exactly what Langford, Washburn, and many of these other men believed could happen if the resources in Yellowstone were true. Contacting his friend Jay Cook, one of the railroad tycoons with the Northern Pacific Railroad Company, he was able to get funding for their expedition in hopes that this could be an establishment that could make them all a great deal of money. In August of 1870, the Washburn-Langford Doane Expedition began. An expedition that would change these men and quite literally change the world. I will now share with you some of the journal entries from Nathaniel P. Langford as they toiled and explored the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. While you listen, I want you to consider this question. If you did not have a phone or a camera while going and exploring such a beautiful area such as Yellowstone, how would you be able to show people the beauties of it? Say you weren't a good artist either. Well, surely the only thing you have left is your words. Now, would you only talk about the objective thing you saw? Or would you weave in emotion and feeling? Well, that is what Langford did. Here are Langford's amazing, yet I will admit, lengthy journals. August 31st, 1870. General Washburn and Mr. Hedges are sitting near me, writing, and we have an understanding that we will compare notes when finished. We are all overwhelmed with astonishment and wonder at what we have seen, and we feel that we have been near the very presence of the Almighty. General Washburn has just quoted from Psalms, "When I behold the work of thine hands, what is man, that thou art mindful of him?" Mine own mind is confused, that I hardly know where to commence in making a clear record of what is at this moment floating past my mental vision. I cannot confine myself to a bare description of the falls of the Yellowstone alone, for these two great cataracts are but one feature in the scene, composed of so many other elements of grandeur and sublimity, that I almost despair of giving to those who, on our return home, will listen to the recital of our adventures, the faintest conception of it. The immense canyon or gorge of rocks through which the river descends, perhaps more than the falls, is calculated to fill the observer with feelings of mingled awe and terror. The stillness is horrible, and the solemn grandeur of the scene surpasses conception. You feel the absence of sound, the oppression of absolute silence. Down, 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 you see the river attenuated to a thread. If only you could hear that gurgling river, lashing with puny strength the massive walls that imprison it and hold it in their dismal shadow. If you could but see a living thing in the depth beneath you. If a bird would fly past you. If the wind would move any object in that awful chasm to break for a moment the solemn silence which reigns there. It would relieve that tension of nerves which the scene has excited, and with a grateful heart you would thank God that he has permitted you to gaze unharmed upon this majestic display of his handiwork. But as it is, the spirit of man sympathizes with the deep gloom of the scene, and the brain reels as you gaze into this profound and solemn solitude. The place where I obtained the best and most terrible view of the canyon was a narrow projecting point situated 2 or 3 miles below the lower fall. Standing there, or rather lying there for greater safety, I thought how utterly impossible it would be to describe to another the sensation inspired by such a presence. As I took in this scene, I realized my own littleness, my helplessness, my dread exposure to destruction, my inability to cope with or even comprehend the mighty architecture of nature. More than all this, I felt, as never before, my entire dependence upon that almighty power who had wrought these wonders. A sense of danger lest the rock should crumble away almost overpowered me. My knees trembled, and I experienced the terror which causes men to turn pale and their countenances to blank with fear, and I recoiled from the vision I had seen, glad to feel the solid earth beneath me and realize the assurance of returning safety. Mr. Hedges and I sat on a table rock to which I have referred, opposite the upper fall, as long as our limited time would permit, and as we reluctantly left it and climbed to the top, I expressed my regret at leaving so fascinating a spot, quoting the familiar line, "A thing of beauty is a joy forever." Mr. Hedges asked me who the author of the line, but I could not tell. I will have to look it up on my return. Yes, this stupendous display of nature's handiwork will be to me a joy forever. It lingers in my memory like the faintly defined outlines of a dream. I can scarcely realize that in the unbroken solitude of this majestic range of rocks, away from civilization, almost inaccessible to human approach, the Almighty has placed so many of the most wonderful and magnificent objects of his creation, and that I am to be one of the few first to bring them to the notice of the world. Truly has it been said that we live to learn how little may be known, and of what we see, how much surpasses comprehension. September 19th, 1870. We had, within a distance of 50 miles, seen what we believed to be the greatest wonders on the continent. We were convinced that there was not on the globe another region where, within the same limits, nature had crowded so much grandeur and majesty, with so much novelty and wonder. Judge then of our astonishment on entering this basin, to see at no great distance before us an immense body of sparkling water, projected suddenly and with terrific force into the air to a height of over 100 feet. We had found a real geyser. Of the later 6, the one we saw in action on entering the basin ejected from a crevice of irregular form and about 4 feet long and 3 feet wide, a column of water to the height of 100 feet. We gave such names to those geysers which we saw in action, as we think will best illustrate their peculiarities. The one I have just described, General Washburn had named Old Faithful because of the regularity of its eruptions, the intervals between which being from 60 to 65 minutes, the column of water being thrown at each eruption to the height of from 80 to 100 feet. Opposite our camp on the east side of the Firehole River is a symmetrical cone resembling an old-fashioned straw beehive. No one supposed that it was a geyser, and until this morning, among so many wonders, it had escaped a second notice. Suddenly, while we were at breakfast this morning, a column of water shot from it, which by quite accurate triangular measurements proved to be 219 feet in height. We named this geyser Beehive. Another we named Giantess. Erupting at a height of 80 feet, the column remained at this height for the space of about a minute, when from the apex of this vast mass, 5 lesser jets shot up into the atmosphere to the amazing height of 250 feet. This was, without exception, the most magnificent phenomenon I had ever beheld. We were standing on the side of the geyser exposed to the sun. Those sparkling rays filled the ponderous column with what appeared to be the clippings of thousands of rainbows. These prismatic illusions disappeared only to be succeeded by myriads of others which continually fluttered and sparkled through the spray during the 20 minutes the eruption lasted. September 20th, 1870. Last night, and also this morning in camp, the entire party had a rather unusual discussion. The proposition was made by some member that we utilize the results of our exploration by taking up quarter sections of the land at the most prominent points of interest. One member of the party suggested that if there could be secured by preemption a good title or 2 or 3 quarter sections of land opposite the lower fall of Yellowstone, and extending down the river along the canyon, they would eventually become a great source of profit to the owners. Mr. Hedges then said that he did not approve of any of these plans, and that there ought to be no private ownership of any portion of that region, but that the whole of it ought to be set apart as a great national park, and that each one of us ought to make an effort to have this accomplished. His suggestion met with an instantaneous and favorable responses from all members of the party, and each hour since the matter was first broached, our enthusiasm has increased. It has been the main theme of our conversation today as we journeyed. I lay awake half of the night thinking about it, and if my wakefulness deprived my bedfellow, Hedges, of any sleep, he only has himself and his national park proposition to answer for it. Our purpose to create a park can only be accomplished by untiring work and concentrated action into a warfare against the incredulity and unbelief of our national legislatures, when our proposal shall be presented for their approval. Nevertheless, I believe we can win the battle. I do not know of any portion of our country where a national park can be established furnishing to visitors more wonderful attractions than here. These wonders are so different from anything we have ever seen. They are so various, so extensive. That feeling in my mind, from the moment they began to appear until we left them, has been one of intense surprise and incredulity. Every day spent in surveying them has revealed to me some new beauty, and now that I have left them, I begin to feel skepticism, which clothes them in memory clouded by doubt. As Langford and the rest of the Washburn party experienced the wonders that were Yellowstone, selfish desires faded, giving way for quite possibly the most American of ideas. That, unlike the parks in Europe, which are for the most part reserved only for the most noble and the most rich, they would, as be American tradition, reject that, rebelling against the solely capitalistic interests of the time, seeking to preserve that which was most beautiful, and make one a park for we the people. Upon returning from the expedition, Langford and Hedges started getting to work. Langford going to places like Washington, D.C. and New York City, giving public addresses, trying to convince the masses of what they had seen and why it was important. At one such address, in January of 1871, one man, Ferdinand V. Hayden, a lead geologist and surveyor for the U.S. Geological Survey, was struck by the incredible descriptions that Langford had given. Hayden, already planning on going on more expeditions out west to survey the great land out there, decided to meet with Langford to discuss the expedition and try to receive any information they could regarding it. Not long after, however, Henry D. Washburn passed away at the young age of 38. This deeply saddened Langford, losing a close friend of his who had such a desire in the creation of this idea of a national park. And although he was saddened, it did spark in his heart an even greater desire to see this through. Now, during the time of Langford's addresses as well, 3 men also got to work. Walter Trumbull, Charles Moore, and one Truman Everts, whose story I will mention in another video, began contacting local newspapers and even nationwide newspapers in hopes of getting their discoveries published. They were able to get in contact with one specific newspaper called Scribner's Monthly, in which they submitted some of their reports, some of their stories, and especially Langford's descriptions, as well as that of Lieutenant Doane. What was especially intriguing to Scribner's Monthly was that these men had taken rough sketches of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. It was no longer just these fabricated ideas written on paper, but now it was images sketched poorly, but still sketched. However, Scribner's Monthly did not want to publish basically child's drawings, and so they called on one of their associates, one Thomas Moran, to come in and give an artistic edit to the drawings. Thus, in early 1871, Thomas Moran would begin drawing Yellowstone based on very crude and childish drawings, a place he had never seen, unfortunately a place that he likely never would see. Well, finally, come May of 1871, Scribner's Monthly published Wonders of Yellowstone, a newspaper clipping that, although short, attracted the attention of the whole nation. People started wondering, is this place real? Is it true? These are interesting images, but we don't know if it's legit. And while those of the Washburn Expedition were doing everything they could to try to get people to believe in their stories, they just did not have enough credibility for the general public to believe such insane claims. However, during this, Ferdinand Hayden started getting to work as well. Hayden was able to get permission from Congress to stage an expedition out. Also getting the assistance of the Union Pacific Railroad, he was able to secure passage all the way to Salt Lake City, Utah. Hayden acquired the help of many others as well. Zoologists, botanists, geologists, surveyors, medical personnel, and most importantly, in Hayden and Langford's opinion at least, artists and photographer. Hayden, though moved by the passion and energy of the Washburn Expeditionists, knew that in order to get the general public to believe in such an idea, they needed more solid evidence. Hayden and Langford believed that if they had a professional geologic report written up by one of the head geological surveyors, as well as some better artist renditions, as well as possibly an actual photograph of the area, it could be enough to sway politicians in Washington. A friend of his, and Langford's oddly enough, Jay Cook, was also very interested in supporting future expeditions to this Yellowstone area. So much so that Jay Cook believed that if this could be established, it could be a great boon to his idea of a railroad coming out there and bringing vast amount of tourists. And so he introduced Hayden to Thomas Moran. Now, Thomas Moran, already a very well-known painter, but was also, oddly enough, fairly experienced now with painting Yellowstone. Hayden eagerly accepted the assistance and accompaniment of Thomas Moran. Hayden was also able to get the assistance of 2 other friends he had, William Jackson, a photographer, and Henry Elliott, an artist. He believed that with the assistance of his own geological survey, Thomas Moran's expertise in painting, Jackson's skills as a photographer, and Elliott's artistry could, just maybe, convince Congress that this place was not only real, but worth preserving. Finally, in May, after receiving transportation via the Transcontinental Railroad all the way to Salt Lake City, which had just been completed a few years prior, and after assembling all the needful equipment, on June 8th, they headed for Bozeman, Montana. They went through the Snake River Plains of Idaho, up and over the Continental Divide, and eventually arriving at a small fort just outside of Bozeman, Montana. Now, for some perspective on this, Once they left the Bozeman Trail, they were on their own. There were no trails, roads that went into this greater Yellowstone area, and so everything they brought was on mules and horses. This is a lot of stuff. And so for all those people, you have to have supplies, whether it's food, cooking ware, places to sleep, all that equipment, not even including the cartographer's supplies, the scientific supplies, and especially the photography equipment, which was incredibly heavy. That included very heavy photo apparatus, darkroom equipment, and all the chemicals needed at the time to take a picture, as well as fragile glass panels. This was not going to be easy, and it was going to be very risky. Nevertheless, knowing these difficulties, they pressed forward. They followed the Yellowstone River all the way to Tower Falls. Following around this, they arrived at Yellowstone Lake. They followed the river down to what now is called Hayden Valley. This then took them to the site that then changed the entire idea of Yellowstone National Park, and that was the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone. It was here that the photographers, artists, and painters really got to work. Traversing around the canyon, they arrived at certain areas. Moran and Jackson, working together, were able to find the best areas to capture the essence that is Yellowstone, and they did it quite well. But this is also the reason that a lot of their images, or at least some, look very similar as they were doing it in the same area. I think it's quite incredible to see the black and white photos here, and then the more colorful artistic versions of Moran as well. With the combination of the objectivity of Jackson's photographs, along with the creative and colorful paintings from Moran, in addition to the scientific, geological, and geographical reports from Hayden, they were sure and they believed that they could have success in convincing Congress. When they returned, Hayden took these discoveries, the paintings, the photographs, the drawings, straight to Congress along with his reports. And for the first time in U.S. history, a geologist spent hours going over scientific data with Congress, trying to convince them to set apart a certain tract of land as a national park. By using the photographs, drawings, and paintings to give at least visual support to the tangible reality that existed in Yellowstone, Hayden was able to convince them. Hayden, Langford, and Crook, then working together to the extent of which we are not entirely sure, started drafting up some ideas for the legislation to be passed to protect Yellowstone as a national park. And after presenting the ideas to the government officials in D.C., a miracle happened. And for the first and probably the last time in U.S. history, Congress made a decision in a swift and timely manner. And in December of 1871, Congress wrote up the Yellowstone National Park Protection Act, which then on March 1st, 1872, was signed into law by Ulysses S. Grant, making Yellowstone the world's first national park. Now, I will in other videos go more in depth about the park's history, specifically the post-creation history. However, I will also make some videos talking about the expeditions themselves, because the brief overviews I gave of them do not even complete the story at all in any way, shape, or form, and there are some pretty crazy stories that have to do with them. I will also state that things weren't perfect after 1872. Things didn't just go perfect for the national park, and they wouldn't even all the way to today. There's still issues. However, the most American idea was accomplished due to the hard work and foresight of people who saw value in the beauties of this incredible world in which we live. But as this video has dragged on, I would like to conclude with 3 more things. First, a question. So what? Why does any of this matter? Does it matter? Is there a reason to protect Yellowstone? Is there a reason to conserve and preserve these incredible beauties of this earth? That I will let you decide. But I would encourage you to hold out on making a decision until you see it for yourself. And so, to truly conclude, I will share the last 2 things. 2 quotes from people from the Washburn Expedition. First, from Lieutenant Doane, and last, from Nathaniel P. Langford once again. From Lieutenant Doane. Thus the Yellowstone Expedition closed. We saw many strange and wonderful phenomena, many things which would require volumes for adequate description, and which in future geography will be classed among the wonders of the earth. as a country for sightseers, it is without peril. As a field for scientific research, it promises great results. It is probably the greatest laboratory that nature furnishes on the face of the globe. And lastly, from Langford, in the publications of his journals. As I recall the events of this exploration made 35 years ago, it is a pleasure to bear testimony that there was never a more unselfish or generous company of men associated for such an expedition. I here present the original notes, just as they were penned under inspiration of the overwhelming wonders which everywhere revealed themselves to our astonished vision. And as I again review and read the entries made in the field and around the campfire, I feel all the thrilling sensations of my first impressions, and with them is mingled the deep regret that our beloved Washburn did not live to see the triumphant accomplishment of what was so dear to his heart, the setting apart at the headwaters of the Yellowstone of a national public park or pleasuring ground for the benefit and enjoyment of the people.